We recently did an episode, Pat, where we were talking about the really unfortunate failure rate of check rides, which is now nearing 50%. And we
Yeah.
looked at it from the applicant's perspective. But there's another person involved in this, the CFI.
Yep.
And frankly, the CFI has a professional obligation and responsibility to prepare that student. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but as a designated pilot examiner, do you see applicants where the failure in paperwork or knowledge or the ability to present themselves to you can be attributed to the CFI?
Oh, without question. As a matter of fact, about 2 weeks ago, um, I was doing a check ride for a commercial applicant, and there was an incorrect logbook entry that should have been PIC by the candidate, and the instructor logged it as dual. And that was the 5 hours of night time with the landings at a towered field. And again, not my rules, but I had to go to the regs and say, didn't you read this paragraph and
Mm-hmm.
how it's supposed to be logged? And what that meant was the applicant had to go back and repeat those 5 hours.
Well, let me ask you a question because that brings something to mind that I think is really important. When I started as a CFI, DPEs were still a fearsome ogre in the distance, much like when I was a private pilot applicant, and I was genuinely scared of the guy I took my private pilot ride. The rumors that he hit people and yelled at people and stuff terrified me. But I went and I passed, and life was good. How often do you or your fellow DPEs that you talk to have CFIs schedule time to talk with them just to say, what do you want to see when my student comes in? What bugaboos do you come across that I can help my student prepare for? Does that happen, or are they operating in isolation without involving you at all?
Um, mostly actually it's in isolation. Occasionally I'll get invited to come and sit down and talk with CFIs, but um, oftentimes if it's at a school, it's kind of in isolation. If it's an independent CFI, oftentimes they'll call me and say, "What are you looking for?"
Would this be something where maybe a flight school, say a Part 61 flight school, that uses you or somebody like you as a TPE, could they just book time with you, book an hour or two and say, come on in and talk to the instructor corps and let them know where the big failures are. Let's get our game up, because when nearly half of applicants are not satisfactory completing the ride, I think this indicates there's a real problem, and there's no doubt that rests in large part on the CFIs.
Oh, absolutely. The applicant is not off the hook here. He or she needs to um, be almost as aware, if not equally aware, of the requirements of the check ride from the paperwork standpoint. Maybe not so much the nuances of all of the endorsements, but certainly there are endorsements that are needed, and they need to have their personal documents with them. Their certificate, their medical, and all that kind of stuff. Um, they need to present me with the Aero documents. They need to be able to show me that the airplane is airworthy without me having to coach them through. Okay, well, let's start at the back of the logbook and work forward. Those kind of things. I shouldn't have to do that. Um, the check ride actually hasn't officially started at that point. We're just qualifying them before we actually start. When IACRA is signed, sealed, and delivered, that's when the go button is. But
That's a factor though, because nearly a quarter of check rides don't get past that point.
yeah,
Almost 25% of check rides, the applicant's just not qualified. So as a CFI, are there things I can do? I mean, can I sit down with my student? Could I even insist my student book time with me and let's review? Let's make sure we'll go through your logbook, make sure everything's there. We'll look at all my endorsements for you, make sure they're worded correctly. Can I do that and just let the applicant know this is part of the process? I'm not trying to soak you. I'm trying to save you
Yeah.
$1,000 on an unsatisfactory check ride
Yeah.
because there's an endorsement that's incorrect.
Yeah. Not only can you, but you should. Um, you should sit down, and especially if another CFI was involved in the flight training, maybe at another school in another state or who knows what, and look with a very critical eye on that logbook, every single entry. How was it logged? Was it logged correctly, near as you can tell? And depending on, whether we're doing private, commercial, or instrument, there are some things. For example, if you're doing instrument training and the applicant even remotely thinks that he or she might want to be a commercial pilot down the road, then the instructor better log at least 10 hours of that instrument training with the use of a view limiting device in accordance with 61.129. And there's a specific uh, paragraph that talks about that requirement. And if we're doing a commercial check ride and I can't find 10 hours that's logged with the use of a view limiting device or with the reference to 61.129, I may not be able to count that instrument rating towards the commercial. And that's become a thing recently.
There's a scientific study that I just made up in my head that says 47% of flight students have more than one CFI in their training.
Well, I wouldn't doubt that, but 47% of the statistics are made up 25% of the time. So
Darn right. But the point of it is, I don't have to just go through with the applicant as a CFI and check my work. I have to check the preceding instructor's work.
right,
If they came to me with a solo endorsement and I'm helping finish them up, I do have a responsibility to go look, is that an accurate solo endorsement? Were any of those previous endorsements incorrect? Because if they are, not only do I have to fix them, I have to provide the training that allows that to be fixed. And
yes,
I think sometimes we just inherit, and I'm not blaming CFIs, this is just inherent to the industry. It's the
yeah,
way it works.
yeah,
Very often I'm picking up where somebody else left off, and I have to know that the student is actually taken care of. So
yeah,
I've got to actually make sure when that student comes in and says, "Oh, I did the cross country time, I'm just doing the finish up." Well, let's go look. Did you really do the cross country time to the degree it needs to be done? Do you actually have 3 hours or do you have 2.9? And
right,
I actually have a friend who's a Delta captain. He took his private check ride the day before I did. He had 2.9
yeah,
and he couldn't take the ride. And
yeah,
we've talked about it, and he's been very successful, but he's told me honestly, that is so demoralizing. It's so frustrating. You took the time, you amped up, you studied, you show up, you you rent the plane, you pay for the check ride, and we can't even get out of the office because
yeah, yeah.
6 minutes is missing out of my logbook.
Yeah, and that is demoralizing. And we talked about this in a previous podcast, but the private pilot requirement for logging, well, actually the requirement for logging any cross country in pursuit of a rating or certificate is more than 50 miles, right? And a number of times I have had applicants show up and one leg is 50 miles exactly according to ForeFlight.
Yep.
I can put a plotter on it. And if I move it just a little bit one way or the other, well, maybe it's a little bit more than 50 miles. But now you know, I'm starting to show the applicant that I'm willing to hedge a little bit. And I can't do that. I won't do it, but I can't either. So now I'm looking for other sources that will give me something that I can hang my hat on. And AirNav, for example, calls that particular cross country I'm referring to is 50.1. But
Mhm.
ForeFlight calls it 50 because apparently it rounds down.
Yeah, and
So
that matters. I
it does
mean, the
matter.
specifics are important, and we can forget about this sometimes as CFIs as we're going through our work. And let's face it, one of the good things about being a CFI, you become very good at the basics because you consistently do it over and over and over, teaching other students.
Right,
When I was instructing in seaplanes, it's an add-on. It's specific tasks that I do 30 takeoffs and landings in a lesson.
right,
It's constant. But that can lull us into complacency that I'm so familiar with what I'm doing. One student's the same as the next student, the same as the next, and they're not. We really do have to have that sense of professionalism and responsibility to sit down with our student not just doing the pre-flight brief and the post-flight debrief, which should happen in every lesson,
Right.
but as we near that final training session where we sign off IACRA and send them on their ride, we really should be sitting down and verifying every bit of information that we've got the hours, we've got the endorsements, but also that the student knows how to get through the maintenance logbook, knows how to show everything. They're going to be nervous, and we've got the DPE does all they can to dispel that. But let's face it, for all your charms, Pat, they're still nervous.
They are nervous.
The CFI needs to get them down, whether that's tabbing pages or bending corners over, whatever they can do to make sure the applicant isn't going through the check ride for the first time when it's real.
I had a a ride, I don't know, it was several months ago, and the applicant allegedly had looked through the logbooks a few days before with the instructor. Took him 10 minutes to find the pedostatic altimeter check, and he went past it backwards and forwards 4 or 5 times. One time he actually had his thumb on it while he was looking on the other page, and I'd seen the logbooks in this airplane before. I knew exactly where it was, and I'm just sitting here kind of like this, with the kind of a neutral look on my face, and just kind of sitting there. And meanwhile, the instructor's sitting over in the corner, just cringing. And again, the check ride hadn't even started yet, so he was welcome to jump in and help him. But I'm just waiting for the time to pass.
Yeah.
And he finally found it. But again, imagine the stress level of that applicant when I'm sitting there essentially looking over his shoulder and he can't find it. There's a stress hormone. We've talked about this before, Jamie, and we talk about it in our safety seminars all the time. There's a stress hormone called cortisol.
Mhm.
And when that hits you, your brain just kind of stops working.
Yep,
And you
that's
could be
true.
looking right at that pedostatic altimeter check and absolutely right over your head. And
Well,
so,
and even if we look at this from the CFI's perspective of self-interest, I'm building up my students' confidence in me throughout that training. They view me as a real resource, as somebody who's good at this, who's guiding them through it. And if I send them off to a check ride and they're not prepared and they can't even get through the oral, and that's 20, 25% of the check rides, or they can't perform well on the check ride because they didn't know something, and that's almost 50%. Well, they no longer have a lot of confidence in me. They might be frustrated in their own performance, but they're going to think on some level I let them down.
yeah,
And if I want to work with this student again for an instrument and a commercial and a CFI, or 5 years down the road when I move up the ladder and I go to a company and I find out they got there before me,
hmm,
I really want to have a good reputation, and it's granted, it's because I'm a shallow, delicate flower, Pat. I need people to like me. But I want to be professional enough that every student I have that leaves not only says I was successful, I got my ticket, but that guy helped me. He was fantastic. And
yeah,
and I have that feeling about some of the instructors I had coming through.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that's really, I think we can look at this legitimately from a self-interest standpoint. I want to be good at this. I want to take care of my students well because that benefits me in the long run.
It does. Benefits everybody. So yeah, the CFI plays a huge, huge part. The applicant is not without responsibility, but let's face it, this is the first time, perhaps, that the applicant has ever been through a process like this. And again, I'm talking more on the private level at this point, but it's the first time, perhaps, that an applicant has ever been through this before, and the instructor should be sensitive to that and recognize that it might take a little more hand holding than it might for an instrument rating or a commercial or an ATP or CFI or double I or whatever the case may be as you go up the food chain.
So if we review here, we have the CFI can take an active role in verifying all the endorsements and the times in the logbook so the student knows and tell the student so the student's confident they've got it, they've walked through it. They can talk to a DPE or even schedule time for a DPE to come to their flight school and talk to other instructors What do you want to see? What are common deficiencies? What can we do to help prepare our applicants better? And they can look at this job as something that benefits them in terms more than hours and money, but in status and respect. I think if we do all those things as CFIs, we can improve the outcomes for our applicants. And let's face it, as a CFI, my success is based on their success. If I have half of my students failing, that suggests maybe I'm not the best CFI for them.
Well, if you have half of your students failing, and I know you say this in a little bit facetiously, but if you have half of your students failing, I suspect it won't be long before the FAA comes knocking at your door and saying, "Let's talk about your qualifications as a CFI."
You know, that's true. I actually know a CFI who sent 4 people on check rides where their paperwork was incomplete and they
Mm,
can't do it. I mean, that even as the owner of the flight school, that would really anger me. You're not doing your job. You're not verifying this stuff. You're costing my customers money unnecessarily,
yeah.
and you're having them go away. Not saying you're a lousy instructor. They're saying I run a lousy school.
Yep.
So there are a lot of really good reasons to ramp up your methodology and put in the extra time, even if you're not getting paid for ground time. And I know that's controversial, but you should be getting paid for it. But even if you're not, even if that's the way your school runs, prepare those students, because in the long run, we benefit,
That's
everybody.
exactly right. You're exactly right.
Pat, I think we've cracked this nut. We solved the problem, and all of aviation training is going to get better thanks to your genius and the Mad Props channel.
Hey, this is always fun, man. I look forward to these sessions, and it's kind of like having a conversation with a psychiatrist, and not having to pay for it.
I feel similarly. Maybe there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
Pat, thanks a lot. We'll get together and do this again real soon. I hope this was beneficial to CFIs and nobody takes offense over this, but Pat and I have been doing this a long time. I just came back from the National Aeros, what is it? National NAFI, National Aviation Flight
Association of
Instructors.
Flight Instructors, National Association of Flight Instructors.
See, that's that cortisol thing. I'm so nervous on camera, I couldn't think. But this is a legitimate problem that has to be addressed. And if we don't address it at the CFI core individually, it's not going to go away. So, Pat, thanks for talking honestly about this. Thanks for sharing your insight with other instructors and applicants. And I know you're off to go work with a whole bunch of kids this morning and just
Yeah.
introduce them to aviation. So, thanks for everything you do, man. You're tops.
And as right back at you, my friend. Adios.
See you next time.
Bye.